Margaret Thatcher, author of The Downing Street Years and now The Path to Power. In writing both of these books, what did you learn?
I think you see the whole of the 11.5 years at Downing Street laid out in a way that you never see it when you're living it day by day. And you're amazed at how much happened during those years and how much you managed to crowd into the time. And when you look at the path to power, again, it's the first time that you see the whole sweep of your life. And you don't see it with the anxieties you get from day to day. You see it as it actually happened, and you manage to surmount it. And so sometimes the book can give not a wholly accurate impression, because you're writing it with hindsight. Whereas when you live through them, you know all the anxieties you face each day, and the future is unknown. And that's the different aspect, really, of writing a bit of history and living the future.
Early on in the book, you write a lot about your father, actually more about your father than your mother, almost.
Well, my father was to some extent a public figure as well, locally. My mother made it possible for him to be a public figure by very well organizing the house and helping in the business. And she was a very, very good businesswoman. She'd had her own business. It was a dressmaking business, and my father had his own grocery business. And they were both savers. And because they saved, they were able to buy their own business. My father had left school at the age of 13, because in those days there weren't the facilities to stay on. But he had an excellent mind, and he was the best self-educated man I ever knew. He read and taught us to read and to discuss. And so in a way he influenced our thoughts much more than our mother. And our mother, in fact, made it possible for him to do all the things he did by stepping in and helping with the business and running the family. An excellent cook, very good dressmaker, could in fact decorate the house and so on.
Do you remember the first book you read?
The first book I read? I think that would be difficult, but it would probably have been a miscellaneous poetry book, because I enjoyed poems very much. It also, of course, have been every Sunday. It would have been some of the Bible.
A quote from the book that you say your dad said quite often: never do things just because other people do them.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Our life was very organized, and at weekends we were strong Methodists. And so on Sunday I went to morning Sunday school, then joined the family with morning service, then afternoon Sunday school, occasionally sometimes evening church as well. And one evening I said to my father one Sunday evening, "Look, my friends are going out for a walk, and I would like to go with them." And he said to me, "Never do things just because other people do them. That's a very bad thing to do. You make up your own mind what you want to do, and then you do it, but never just follow the crowd." It was very tough, but very good advice. I didn't go out for that walk.
Is there a political lesson in that?
Oh, yes. You never be bewitched by public opinion polls. They change very quickly. Set out your political principles, explain what you believe and why, the policies which flow from them, and how you're going to implement them. And then my father would say something else. If you set your hand to a task, you must complete it. He would say, it's easy to be a starter, but are you a sticker too? It's easy enough to begin a job. It's harder to see it through. So he'd say, you persevere until you see it through. So I never did any U-turns.
One of the many photographs in the book is this one, in your hometown. Can you explain this photograph?
That, I think, is at the end of the war. My father was mayor, and you see he's just standing behind the Union Jack, and my mother, I think, beside him. And it'd be a march past, because we were a town with a number of airfields not far away from us. We were in what I call bomber country. And there'd probably be a march past and father taking it.
Another quote, you say, "I was too young to canvass for my father during council elections, but I was put to work folding red leaflets, election leaflets, extolling the virtues of the conservative philosophy."
Oh, yes. We didn't have a great deal of party politics in local government in those days. It came in later. But we did have a general election in 1935. I was only 10. We were supporting the Conservative candidate. There wasn't a great deal I could do except fold what we call an election address to every voter. The candidate sends an election address, usually with a photograph of himself and his family on it, what he believes and what he intends to do during the coming Parliament. And this is quite a big job to fold them, address the envelopes, and the post is free. Every candidate has one free election. Come election day, and then you have to try to get your people to the poll to vote. And outside you'll have one person standing, and so will the other parties, taking the numbers of those who are voting, which you then, someone takes back to the committee room, so you know which of your supporters have voted, and which you have to go and try and get out to vote later in the day. And I was a runner from the school where the polling station, the voting was taking place, to the committee room with the names of the people and numbers who voted. So quite early on, I was involved. And I remember our candidate, who was Sir Victor Warrender, who was later Lord Warrender, and he was Under Secretary to the Admiralty, coming and visiting the committee room. The candidate always tours all committee rooms, so did I. And I can remember the great thrill it was to meet him. We thought this was a very great man. And I saw him years later in Switzerland. He only died just recently. So we were involved. 1935 was a great year. It was also the Silver Jubilee of King George V and Queen Mary. All of these things are vivid in my memory. But whatever happens in a small town, 25,000, grocer's shop, father on the council, later mayor, involved in Rotary, involved in the church. We were very much a community. And we knew if anyone needed help, and were prepared always to lend a hand. And my father was always involved. He was a very good speaker, too.
How far from London?
110 miles, say about, it would be about 3 hours on the roads.
You also write, one final note about your father, the 1952 council election, and you say in the book, I tried to take as an example the way he left office, your own departure from 10 Downing Street in 1990. What happened?
Yes. My father had been on the council for years. He'd not only been mayor, he'd been a chairman of our finance committee. And then in those days, you had elected councillors, but there was also what's called an aldermanic bench, senior councillors who were not elected, but the council asked them to stay on and made them aldermen, which was a great honour. So they always sat up in a separate part of the council and had special gowns. When the political complexion of the council changed and it went Labour, they asked my father's alderman to stop being an alderman and to leave. And this was not thought very well of in our local town, because your aldermen were people who, whatever their politics, were men of wisdom or women of wisdom, were highly regarded. And my father, I think, was deeply hurt, but he quietly made a very short statement, took off his gown, aldermanic gown, and laid it down and said, "In honour I took up this gown. In honour I hope I lay it down," and quietly walked out. And I think there was scarcely a dry eye, and he was inundated with letters after that, with great dignity.
In your own experience?
My own experience was it suddenly happened, totally suddenly. These things do come suddenly. And I just I decided I was 2 votes short of the required 15% majority over the next candidate. And I thought, well, I'm not going to go through another round. I've been here 11.5 years. And if I can't get a clear majority to get through in the first round, they'll have to have a second attempt without me. And then mine was quite different because I had there to stay for 5 days, and also there was a confidence motion, a no confidence motion in the House of Commons. So I had the most dramatic debate, and just at a time when they knew I'd offered my resignation. And I think it was the most dramatic debate, and with colossal cheers and colossal repartee, that the House of Commons has ever seen for quite a time. And then I just had to go on until John Major won the leadership election. And the leadership of the party also, if you're the party in power, would carry the prime ministership with it.
You write about Oxford 1943 to 1947, and you say politics was a nursery for talent at Oxford.
Yes, Oxford was a nursery for MPs, but not far from London. So all of our meetings were addressed by MPs or ministers, so we met a lot of them in those days. Naturally, they were interesting days. It was the end of 43 I went up, so the year 44, the time of the Normandy landings, and we knew we would win eventually, but it was very, very tough. And at the time, Winston Churchill had also set in hand many studies of reconstruction, because he knew with many, many people coming back from the war, and we'd had a tough time in the 30s, we'd need to have a rather different world. So the whole idea of possibly a health service and pensions for all was coming and was being discussed at that time. But mainly the anxiety was what was happening in the war, and of course it ended on a day when I was up at Oxford in May 1945, and there were great celebrations. In 1944, it was not the normal university entry, because we had many, many people who were invalided out of the armed forces, and they came back, so we were a much older age group than was normal. We were able to profit from their experiences and the things which they told us. I was taking a science degree. My tutor was working on the very first antibiotic, which was penicillin, and she, Dorothy Hodgkin, quite brilliant, she was a Nobel Prize winner, managed to get out the structure of penicillin. I mentioned that because we're so accustomed to antibiotics now that it's just as well to remember the colossal advances of science that have taken place since 1945.
When did you study chemistry?
Well, I went to Oxford to study chemistry. I went to study a science degree. I had to choose between the sciences and the arts. I'd had an extremely good chemistry teacher. How often your future is determined by a very good teacher, and so was mine. So I went up to Oxford to read chemistry. It was a 4-year degree at that time. But I could, if I went up at 17, I could only at that time, so long as there was war, had 3 years, because one would automatically have been called up for the following year. So I went a year early to try to get the 3 years in.
You read about Mrs. Stella Gatehouse.
Yes, indeed.
Who was she?
She was a marvelous person. In our political organization, we were taught to how to speak in public, not to go on for too long, and taught really to be fluent, to speak without notes. And she was extremely good. And she really tried to teach us not to talk in elliptical phrases, but to make clear what we were saying.
At what point in your mind did you say, I want to be in the House of Commons?
In my mind, it crystallized in a very strange way. It was during one recess, almost at the end of my time at Oxford, and several of us who knew one another went to a party in a village where I had a friend. And as so often happens after the party, you sit around in the kitchen and have a cup of tea or some lemonade or something, and we were just talking. And of course I was talking politics, and all of a sudden, one of the people said there, what you really want to do is to become an MP, don't you? And that was the first time it was crystallized for me. And I said, oh yes, I would love to, yes. But then you see, I couldn't think of it, because in those days members of Parliament were paid very little, and I had to earn my own living, and if you're on the Labour side, obviously you usually had some help from a trade union. But later, when we were paid more, it was possible for me to think about it. But so often these things happened to me. The path to power, there wasn't a path there that you walked along and said, I'll get to that milestone by that certain day or year. There was no path there. You made it yourself, and so often the unexpected happened. And it was by talking about the things which I was greatly interested in that gradually one came to the idea that I would like to be a member of Parliament one day.
How much did you get paid? Do you remember?
In those days, yes, I do remember, it was £400 a year. Of course, there's been a lot of inflation since then.
Mark and Carol, your twins, when did they come?
They came in 1953. We'd been married 2 years, and I thought I was very lucky. My only children to have 2 in one go, and to have a boy and a girl. And of course, as you know, when you have children, it changes your whole life. You begin to live far more for them.
Did you know when you were pregnant that you were going to have twins?
No, I didn't know until the day they were born. They were 6 weeks early, and I had suddenly to go into hospital because something was happening. And the doctor had told me that I was to have an X-ray the following Monday, but on the previous Thursday things began to happen, so I had to go into hospital. And it was then that we discovered there were 2 of them.
Let me go back before that. When did you meet Dennis?
I met Dennis when I was being considered as a candidate for an industrial parliamentary seat called Dartford, Erith and Crayford. I had put in for that seat, although the chairman had said to a friend of mine, no, we couldn't possibly consider a woman for this seat. It's a very strong industrial seat. She wouldn't do it at all. And my friend had said, well, just have a look at her. And I went down, and I was chosen. And on the night when you've been chosen by the committee, you then go to a big meeting of the whole association. And the person who became my husband was one of the people at a supper party before that meeting. He also very interested in politics, and he had a factory in the area. And he came, and he happened to drive me back to London, because I had to get back to London from Dartford to catch a train to Colchester to work the following morning. And that was in, 1949. We were married in 1951, after I'd fought that seat twice, once in 1950, and then there was another election quickly in 1951. So you see, my whole life has really been almost a series of chances which have shaped the life that I've led, and also, of course, shaped the most important thing of all, which was the man I married, and I couldn't have done it without him. He's been absolutely marvelous.
As the history books continue to write about you and your 11.5 years as Prime Minister, what do you want them to say?
Oh, goodness, it's not what I want them to say. It's what they will say, regardless of what I want. But I hope they will deduce that I acted on very strong political principles. They were all worked out so that we had a political faith to propose, usually based on the philosophy of liberty under a rule of law, with a market economy and private property. And I stuck to the policies which I said I would do. I stuck through thick and thin. That's what my father had taught me. And when you have a change of course, and we had a major change of course when I came into power, we had to. We had to get rid of regulation, taxation down, public expenditure down, a whole different approach. And I stuck to it. It was tough, because transitions from one system to another are always difficult. And then it began to work. I hope they'll say I stuck to that, and I hope they will note that we were the first country to say we will not appease an aggressor. When the Falklands were occupied, I said straight away, the lesson of my life in foreign affairs is never appease an aggressor. Stop him, and stop him quick. The Falklands were invaded on the Friday morning. I called Parliament together on the Saturday, and we said we were going to send a task force down. That task force, led by 2 aircraft carriers, several destroyers and frigates, and all the support ships, was on its way on the Monday. That was the way to take decisions. The aggressor was stopped, turned off the islands, and the islands occupied by British people were restored to British authority and restored to the people of the islands.
Back to the book, Dormers, one of the early homes.
Yes.
What do you remember about that house?
Yes, I do. We lived in a flat in London until the twins were 4, and I really thought that we must get a garden for the children. And it was not too far from where my husband's factory was at that time in Kent. And we saw it and went to have a look at it, and it had a very nice garden which needed a lot doing to it. It was ideal for the children. They could run and play in the garden. It was the first time they'd been able to do that. And there were lots of young children also in the area. And we changed the garden and rebuilt the garden. And I love doing that. I love gardening.
You put in the book a couple of headlines that you recall back in 1971. You were in the government, in the shadow government at the time?
In 1971, we were in government. It was Ted Heath's government.
The headlines, two of them, "The Lady Nobody Loves" and "Why Mrs. Thatcher is So Unpopular."
Oh, yes, I did, because I was made Secretary of State for Education. We had to cut expenditure because that was the program that we went in on, because taxation got much too high, when we intolerably high, and so we had to cut expenditure to get taxation down. And what was I to do in education? I didn't want to cut the educational side. Education is extremely important, especially to children that have little opportunity. So what I decided to do was to cut the amount of free milk available and to increase the charge for school meals. After all, my parents, who are not very well off, had paid for me to have free milk at school. And I didn't have school meals. I went home for them. I didn't want to economize on the education, so I cut out free school milk, except for children aged from 5 to 7. I kept it in, and I increased the price of school meals. And this was thought at first to be very good. I kept the whole building program intact. I wanted more teachers and so on. And I'd economized on the non-educational things. What I had to do was introduce a bill into the House of Commons to put that measure through. And then the row burst. I was a milk snatcher, etc. I was hard-hearted. All of these things, when you actually do what you ought to do. There's no earthly reason why everyone should have free milk at the taxpayer's expense. It only saved £9 million. And I learned from that, because I could quite easily have cut the £9 million from the capital program. No one would have noticed. That wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to keep the capital program intact and cut out what I thought was not a fair burden for the taxpayer, but keep it in for the youngest children. And the campaign against me was colossal, and I learned from that.
Is there a newspaper or a columnist who particularly annoyed you?
No, I don't think, not a particular columnist. There are a lot of education correspondents. And before we came into power, namely when I was a shadow Minister of Education, that is, we were still in the opposition, I had set out the views that I believed in. And the education correspondents asked me to a lunch, which I've never forgotten. It was in the Cumberland Hotel. And there was only one of my political persuasion. All the rest are very much on the left. They believe totally in comprehensive education. That is to say, no grammar schools or schools with selection by ability. Of any kind. They believed it was not right to stream by ability. It was that terrible egalitarian age. And I said, this is absurd. People like me needed grammar schools. That is to say, schools where you're selected on the basis of what you can do, of your own ability, regardless of background. People like me needed grammar schools to be able to compete to those who had a private education. But I learned from that. They were all absolutely against me in the egalitarian atmosphere of that time. It's going now, because they realize how much damage it has done to education.
What was the book, The Right Approach?
The Right Approach was a whole statement of our Conservative Party policy that we produced between elections, and it redefined our whole philosophy and the policy points which flowed from it, and it was extremely well received.
When, I asked you earlier about when you wanted to be a member of the House of Commons, when did you decide that you wanted to be Prime Minister or the leader of the Conservative Party?
Again, it was one of those coincidences that have happened and been so powerful in my life. I held very much the same views about policy, redefining it, as one of my close colleagues, Sir Keith Joseph, a brilliant man, absolutely brilliant, a man of great humanity and great modesty. And after the end of Ted's government in 1974, when we lost the election, Labour got back in, Keith Joseph and I decided that we departed from true Conservative policy and espoused many rather left-wing things. And we must really redefine our policy, think it out anew. And we set up something called a Center of Policy Studies. And we had many academics, many businessmen. We had both the best brains and the best experience helping us. And we were getting on very well. Keith doing a marvelous series of speeches. One, for example, monetarism is not enough to keep inflation down. You've got to have an enterprise economy and so on. And then he made just an unfortunate speech where he used some phrases from a sociologist, which were not his, about social groups D and E, etc., and the numbers of children that were being born there. And there were banner headlines against him. The press camped outside his house for 3 or 4 days. They wouldn't let him or his family alone. You know what happens. They must have a statement from you. You're almost a prisoner in your house. And on the Monday evening, and maybe in the Tuesday, Monday, at the beginning of that week, I was in my little study at the House of Commons. And he telephoned and said, "Can I come along and see you?" Yes, of course. And he came in and said, "I've come to tell you that I simply cannot stand to be leader of the party for the leadership election. I have had a terrible time in the last few days, and my family and I just can't go through that, and I can't put them through it. So I'm not going to stand." I was about to try to persuade him. He said, "No, don't try to persuade me. I'm not going to stand." This was a terrible shock. It was not only this remarkable man, but a whole political philosophy that we had worked on. And so I heard myself saying, "Well, Keith, if you're not going to stand, someone who holds our view of politics has to stand. And so I will stand instead." And he was very relieved. But I went home that evening and said to Dennis, "I'm going to stand for the leadership of the party." He said, "Oh, God, you must be mad. You haven't a hope." And of course, I didn't think I had a hope either. But I hadn't stood to be leader of the party. Just like that. I'd stood to try to persuade some others that our way was right. And maybe some others, if I said I would stand, would come out and say they'd also stand, and perhaps one of them would be chosen. But someone with our views had to stand. That's how it came about.
Quote from the book, you say, "I felt sorry for Ted Heath personally. Nonetheless, I had no doubt that Ted ought to go."
Yes, we had done a very big U-turn from our excellent policies on which we came into power in 1970. We'd had a very difficult time, and we'd done a complete U-turn on everything we believed in. We'd had a prices and incomes policy. We'd become interventionist in industry, and that didn't work either. And we'd done a U-turn on trade union reform. We put a great bill through, and the trade unions just wouldn't have it, and they went on big strikes. And so everything had gone wrong. Ted had by that time then lost 3 elections out of 4, and he had become really much more on the left of the party, doing the things we said we'd not do. And so I did feel he had to go. But it was not to replace him by someone who held the same views, but someone who held the views on the wing of the party that Keith Joseph and I were very influential in.
You had a campaign bus in 1979?
Yes, we had a campaign bus. We did a much more modern style of campaigning. We'd never had a campaign bus before. So we could get round many villages, and you know, you would speak off the back of a lorry to a crowd in the market square, and you loved it if you were heckled. A political speaker loves it if you get someone interrupting you and really heckling you and putting a rather sharp comment in, and then you can have a debate back quickly.
Do you miss it?
Do I miss it? Yes, but I will not go back. You can't go back. I was 11.5 years as Prime Minister. And it's the young people now who must come on as I came on when I was young.
Lady Thatcher, thank you.
Margaret Thatcher